purpose does the gentleman from North Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Pittenger of North Carolina. Page 32, line 5, after the dollar amount, insert increase by $25 million. Page 72, line 7, after each of the dollar amounts, insert reduced by $25 million.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank the chairman for his leadership and hard work on this bill. My amendment is simple. It's fair, it's fiscally responsible, and it strengthens our national security. My amendment reduces the federal spending for the Legal Services Corporation by $25 million while leaving the program substantially intact. That money is then used to increase funds for the FBI and their critical counterterrorism efforts. The underlying bill appropriates $300 million for the LSC, but Congress has not authorized LSC since 1980. 35 years is much too long to leave a federal program on autopilot. Even the nonpartisan CBO has recognized defunding the LSC as a way to rein in our out-of-control spending, noting that programs receiving LSC grants already receive funding from states, localities, and private entities, as well as from private attorneys involved in pro bono work. Community problems are best solved at the community level, not through the federal bureaucracy. This amendment, however, does not suddenly end the LSC and its programs. It simply reduces funding in a responsible and modest way and applies that money toward critical national security efforts. This amendment prioritizes the spending of taxpayer money on our current needs. Earlier this year, FBI Director James Comey said he has homegrown violent extremist investigations in every single state. Just last month, the Department of Homeland Security Secretary Johnson, said, "We're very definitely in a new environment because of ISIL's effective use of social media, the internet, which is the ability to reach into the homeland and possibly inspire others." He continued saying, because of the use of the internet, we could have little or no notice in advance of an independent actor attempting to strike. But in a congressionally mandated report released in March of this year, the FBI 9/11 Commissioner stated, budget cuts severely hindered the FBI's intelligence and national security programs. Mr. Chairman, given the constant evolving and new threats we face today from terrorism, it is common sense to reduce spending for a program which has other proven avenues of funding and prioritize that funding we do not have for those seeking to protect us from terrorism. I encourage all my colleagues to support the amendment, and with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Pennsylvania seek recognition?
I rise in opposition to this amendment.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
The committee, over the time that I've been on the committee, each and every year has increased its appropriations to the FBI. And this year is no exception. The chairman, in his wisdom, working with a very tough allocation, has provided $8.5 billion. To be exact, $8.489 million, which is a $111 million increase. And I think that the gentleman, if his concern is about us providing adequate funding for the Bureau, he can rest assured that the committee has taken taken that responsibility very seriously. If his concern or effort is to suggest that somehow pro bono lawyers are going to make up the difference for a cut at legal services, you know, in a big city like Philadelphia, it may be so that we have law firms who can have pro bono partners who can spend their time helping people who are not going to be able to pay them. But in large swaths of our country, that's not the case. And legal services was created and helps people, many of whom are veterans, for instance, who are stationed far away from home, who have to fight off efforts by people who are trying to repossess a car or do something else nefarious. They need access to the courts, and so it was President Nixon who created legal services, understanding that one of the things about our country is that it is a country of laws. People have to have access to the courts, and they need representation. So I think that there's already a justice gap. That is the percentage of people eligible to the numbers who are actually able to be helped. And I think this would be unwise. And I hope, and I believe that this House will not support this amendment, because it would be taking from people who need it the most when there's no definitive need for it in terms of where it's being allocated. And I want to yield now to the gentleman, my colleague from the great state of Tennessee, Congressman Cohen, who represents the city of Memphis.
The gentleman from Tennessee is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Fattah.
You all right?
I join with him in opposing this amendment. Legal services is funded at $375 million this year. This budget cuts it $75 million to $300 million. That's a large cut. That's over 20%. It's been cut and cut and cut over the years. Nationally, 50% of all eligible potential clients are turned away from legal services because of lack of funding. And in my district in Memphis, they've lost $300,000, and the staff has been reduced from 50 to 38. When we travel overseas, one of the things that almost every individual you meet up with tells us about America is we envy your justice system. They envy our justice system because people have access to the courts to settle our differences. But if you're poor and uneducated, poor and or uneducated, and you don't have a lawyer, you don't have access really to the legal system. The other side will. If you're a domestic violence victim and you need an attorney and you don't have one, you're subject to further domestic violence. If you are a tenant in an apartment building and you're being read out, the apartment people are going to have attorneys and you won't, and you'll be on the street. So we're talking about victims, domestic victims. We're talking about people who be homeless. We're talking about individuals, American citizens who won't have access to the courts, the envy of people around the world when they look at America, and will be taking it away from them. I'd ask the gentleman to find monies for the FBI somewhere else. The FBI helps bring about justice, but to take it away from an area that gives poor people in America justice, even though it does give money to the FBI to find criminals and hopefully bring justice to them on the criminal side's important, this is not the right place to take the money. And I'd like to yield some time to Mr. Kennedy if I can.
Unfortunately, it's my time to yield, but I agree with the spirit, and I'd be glad to yield some time to the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you.
Gentleman's recognized.
If I could inquire as to my time, Mr. Speaker.
1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for the times of both my colleagues, and I want to recognize the extraordinary commitment of my colleague, Mr. Pittenger, the commitment that he's made to counter-terrorism and trying to protect the safety and security of the United States. I will say, though, Mr. Speaker, I did work as a legal aid attorney, a legal aid volunteer many years ago when I was a law student. We spent countless hours trying to keep a roof over the head of tenants who were being kicked out of their homes through no fault of their own because a landlord wasn't paying a mortgage. Now, you had people that were going homeless because they did nothing wrong but couldn't avail themselves of an attorney. To try to find now ways to gut that funding when, with low interest rates, one of the key methods of funding for legal services across this country are IOLTA accounts, interest on lawyers' trust accounts. Because of low interest rates, that funding has been basically non-existent. In Massachusetts, that went from about $34 million a year down to $4 million a year. We are gutting a very basic tenet of what this country is all about. We spend so much time in these chambers, Mr. Speaker, talking about how these laws are going to be are shaped to touch people's lives, and very little time speaking about the enforcement and the protections that they provide. This is that moment, and I ask my colleagues to vote no on the amendment.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I acknowledge the wonderful work of Mr. Kennedy that he's done with legal services. I would say that the legal services, frankly, has had a long and troubled history of using taxpayer money for political purposes. The LSC affiliated agency once used federal tax dollars to produce pamphlets and political cartoons for political advocacy purposes. Tax dollars were also used to train activists on how to lobby Congress for additional funding. This marked misuse of taxpayer money and redundancy, and many of these programs are offered as well by the state. So I don't question that there is good work that is being done, but at the same time, I think it's prudent and logical that we look and see how this money is not being used wisely and frankly been inappropriately used. So this is a very, very modest cut in this agency. And I would commend this amendment to the House and ask for their